Brazil. It's one of the top 20 economies in the world. Boundless natural resources, a massive trade economy, and better infrastructure than its neighbors, Brazil would seemingly be a place on the rise. But one thing can decimate a nation's prospects for a brighter future: erosion of the rule of law. And that's what's happening in Brazil. We've seen judges try to arrest Elon Musk for creating the rails for free speech. We saw Truth Social and Rumble, two avowed free speech platforms, sue in U.S. federal court to stop enforcement actions in Brazil. And late last week, there was also a decision out of the Brazilian Federal Supreme Court to hold media companies liable for content that violates privacy, even before there's a request for that content to be removed. But the most insane thing happening to the rule of law in Brazil involves their elections. Their most popular candidate for president in the upcoming election is former President Jair Bolsonaro. If he were allowed to stand for election, he would return to power. Does that sound familiar? Kind of the same arc of history we've seen in the United States. But the Supreme Court has determined that Jair Bolsonaro is ineligible to run for president because they claim he organized a coup. Does this sound familiar? The problem for those making the allegations against Bolsonaro is that he was at Disney World during this alleged coup operation. Still too early to tell whether Mickey, Minnie, and Goofy were accomplices. But the people of Brazil are understandably upset that they don't get to select a candidate of their choosing. Tens of thousands rallied in the streets over the weekend.
And we will win! We will victorious! We will give back freedom for our country! Thanks for our great leader, Bolsonaro! That's the message to the world!
Make Brazil great again!
Joining us now, host of the Paulo Figueiredo Show and geopolitical expert, Paulo Figueiredo. So, Paulo, we have what's going on in the streets of Brazil, and then we have what's going on in the courts. Let's start with the courts. What decisions are coming out that are going to affect free speech that you're watching closely?
Oh, Matt, thanks for having me, but it actually happened last Friday. It was a disaster, and people don't grasp the magnitude of what just happened. The world's just second largest social media market, which is Brazil, has implemented a censorship regime that's comparable only to China. We're having decisions with several problematic parts, but the platforms, social media platforms are now required to proactively remove content labeled as hate speech or anti-democratic speech, even though there's no legal definition of either term. So in practice, anything you criticize the Supreme Court or the socialist government can be considered anti-democratic. And, you know, Brazil has a lot of courts. So without a clear standard, any judge in Brazil can classify a content this way, and to avoid the risk, the platforms will resort to strict preemptive censorship. And also, if platforms now receive an extrajudicial notice and fail to remove content, such as defamation or slander, and a court later rules against it, well, they will be held jointly liable. And this means the platforms must now function as internal courts evaluating the merit of every complaint. So in practice, they will adopt a low threshold and remove questionable content preemptively. So left-wing advocacy groups already well organized, they will exploit the system and issue mass extrajudicial notice. So this is pretty much what they created, was a para-state censorship regime that bypasses any form of popular electoral accountability. They pretty much outsource censorship, which is brilliant.
We've seen that in the United States. We saw the Biden administration have a very heavy hand in censoring true information about vaccine side effects during the coronavirus pandemic. And then social media companies said, well, because we are feeling this pressure from the government, we are going to take down stuff that is true. We're going to take down stuff that is a joke or irony or humor in some way. And so are you saying now that social media companies will likely discriminate against conservative viewpoints or pro-Bolsonaro viewpoints or anything that is anti-government with the sword of Damocles of this judicial determination hanging over them?
Yes, because they lost what in the United States the equivalent of the Section 230. So if you can be liable, and if the government labels anything that's anti-government as hate speech or an attack to the government institutions and therefore anti-democratic, what you do is pretty much come up with an algorithm that will prevent these type of contents to be published. And it's not only their original idea. Like you said, it was used in the United States, but last week, the Justice of the Brazilian Supreme Court, they were speaking at a Pointer Institute, an international fact-checking network event in Brazil. So there's no doubt this is being promoted as a global framework. So it's a stepping stone for something identical in Europe, in Canada, and that's it. If Brazil's the second largest market, Europe is the third, and Canada is big as well. If these countries implement these types of censorship, free speech in the West is done. And after all, you got to remember that, Matt. It's impossible to fully jail offense terms of service. So if an algorithm is implemented to do something in Brazil, it will do a pretty similar job in the United States. So what they're doing is they're trying to circumvent the First Amendment to censor anyone globally.
Do you think the social media companies will push back, or are they just going to go into a regime of compliance with this?
They have been complying. I mean, they're actually at fault since the beginning, because the leverage they have in Brazil is immense. Imagine if Google or if Meta just say, well, if this happens, we'll leave Brazil, they will be able to
Is that what they should
get
do?
rid of Moraes.
Do you think that's what they should do, Paulo? Should social media
absolutely.
companies?
I don't know why they're not doing it, because they're pretty much killing their own market. They're trying to comply and comply and comply, but you can only do that to a certain extent, and then they will replicate this globally. So they're pretty much I think it was Hitler that said, or Stalin that said, well, they're producing the ropes that we're going to use to hang them. So that's pretty much what the social media companies are doing. I can understand how they're not negotiating in a more heavy stand in Brazil.
It's hard to think about this outside the context of the most popular person in Brazil not being allowed to run for president, Jair Bolsonaro. He had massive rallies over the weekend in the country. How are people reacting to this assault on democracy?
Yeah, and like you said, we just saw a huge demonstration on the streets of Brazil. Tens of thousands of people protest again, and mostly against Justice Moraes and against the Brazilian Supreme Court and in support of President Bolsonaro. He's leading all the polls, although he may not be allowed to run. When in fact, everything indicates that he will be tried at the end of August and sentenced to decades in prison, effectively for the rest of his life. And what stood out the most in these demonstrations last weekend were multiple signs in English. Brazil speaks Portuguese, but we had signs in English. But people are desperately asking for the United States to help, because about a month ago, Secretary Rubio said that the State Department was preparing global Magnitsky Act financial sanctions against the Supreme Court Justice of Brazil, the de facto dictatorship of Brazil, Moraes. And he said such sanctions were a real possibility. And according to my sources, the department has already completed its review, and it's just waiting on a decision from President Trump.
Well, we'll see if that is forthcoming. Moraes is certainly deserving of sanction with the way he's treated Brazil and, in fact, how he's treated the United States as well. Paulo Figueiredo, host of the Paulo Figueiredo Show, and expert on all things Brazil. Thanks for joining us, as always.
For having me.
O Trump voltou. Isso já deve ter tirado um peso das suas costas. Mas e o Brasil? O nosso país continua atolado, e achar que só a vitória do Trump vai resolver tudo é ilusão. Nada vai mudar sozinho. E pode ter certeza de uma coisa: ficar xingando muito nas redes sociais não vai fazer diferença nenhuma. Você vai continuar esperando alguém fazer alguma coisa por você, um político, um salvador da pátria? Esquece. Se ninguém tomar uma atitude, nada acontece. Eu estou fazendo a minha parte. Eu parei a minha vida por isso. Mas, se você quer saber como pode ajudar sem precisar largar tudo, a resposta é simples: apoiando quem está na linha de frente. Sem esse apoio, sem essa linha de suprimento, esse trabalho morre. Sem estrutura, ninguém avança. Então acessa www.paulofigueiredoshow.com/apoie e com $5 por mês você pode fazer parte disso. Se puder mais, eu recomendo, seja um patrono Gold e participe ativamente no grupo que me ajuda a pautar esse debate. O que vai definir o futuro é quem faz e não quem reclama. A escolha é sua.